The title of this prayer is Your Word. Your word is a light to our feet and a lamp to our path. Your word is a glue of the universe wherein the whole creation coheres. Your word is the address of promise and command by which we live. Your word has come fleshed among us, full of grace and truth. We are creatures of your word, and we give thanks for it. We ponder and give thanks for those who this day act your word for newness and peace and justice. In our thanks for your word, we pray for courage in the name of the one who emptied himself. Amen. Amen. So today we're going to do another impossibly hard parable, but we will prevail. This is Luke 18, the Unjust Judge. Let's see what we can do with this one. I was trying to characterize this to describe it to you. It's like a pearl, maybe a very small pearl, because the message is important but very limited and very hard to find, according to those who have preceded us and those who are smarter than I am. Let's start with Luke 18:1. Then Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always and not to lose heart. The parable starts with 2 and it ends with 5. So this is the parable now. He said, in a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor had respect for people. In that city there was a widow who kept coming to him and saying, "Grant me justice against my opponent." For a while the judge refused, but later he said to himself, "Though I have no fear of God and no respect for anyone, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice, so that she may not wear me out by continually coming." That's the end of the parable. And the Lord said, "Listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God grant justice to his chosen ones who cry to him day and night? Will he delay long in helping them? I tell you, he will quickly grant justice to them, and yet, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?" That's the explanation, which is somewhat helpful. Without that explanation, we would have really nowhere to turn whatsoever. So this is, as I said earlier, a very difficult parable. The parable itself is verses 2 through 5, inclusive. Without the explanation, starting in 6, we would be more lost than we already are. For those of you that are English majors, it's a double indirect narrative parable functioning as a contrast. Stated another way that's a little more understandable, it's a how much more parable. How much more? It's one of the things we really need to remember. It's about prayer and our relationship to God. Martin Luther said, prayer should be brief, frequent, and intense. Brief, frequent, and intense. Getting a little into the culture of first century Palestine, which is critical for this parable, in my opinion. We have widows in our society, but it's not the same. Widows in the first century in Palestine had no legal rights. They were often victimized. They could not inherit, and they were treated pretty badly. This judge, some have theorized, is a Roman judge, not a Jewish judge. And the reason is because the dispute seems to be about real property. And a Jewish judge by himself could not make a determination about real property. It would have to be 3 judges, according to Jewish law. So this judge is probably a Roman judge, so he's not a Jew. The way these courts worked were that the various litigants would pay what they called fees to the judge, and the amount paid by those litigants would determine in large part how that judge would decide. So it's a very corrupt system, and this person that is against the poor widow is probably paid a larger fee and probably has prevailed in the past anyway. What might have happened here, again, we don't know for sure, what might have happened here is this widow's son was taken into the military, and because he could no longer work on the property, on the farm, because he was in the military, she failed to pay her required taxes, and someone had taken the property away from her because she couldn't pay the taxes because her son was taken away from her and couldn't do the work necessary to generate the income. This was probably delivered to Jesus' disciples, and as I said earlier, and I'm going to say it 3 or 4 more times, it's a how much more parable. How much more? Your first instinct, and mine, is to say it's about persistence in praying. If you pray continuously, persistently, God will give in. Almost because you're intimidating, like this woman, this widow, did to the judge. That's not what it's about. It's not about persistence in praying. Or, as one of my commentators said, it's not about badgering God. It's not about badgering God. It's about the character of God and the necessity of staying alert and ready for God's final vindication and judgment, the second coming, when Jesus will come back and things will change big time. That's what it's about. Now, there is a tension always in the New Testament in different places between when Jesus will come, whether it's sooner or later. Good morning. Why don't you come over here? Well, pull the chair back. You're good. Wherever you want to be. There is a conflict in the New Testament in a lot of places about when Jesus will come back. Jesus himself implied and said many times that it would be sooner within the lifetime of those living. And so there is confusion in his early followers. This gospel might have been written in maybe 40 years after Jesus or 50 years after Jesus died and was resurrected. So people are saying, well, Jesus said that he was coming back sooner than later, and so Jesus is addressing this during his lifetime and his ministry, and it continues to be an issue after Jesus has died and been resurrected for those who are followers, for those who are writing Gospels. And, let's face it, it's continuing to be an issue today. Is it sooner or is it later? And so Jesus, in part, in this parable, is addressing that question that all of us have now and those people had later. So again, I said it's a how much more parable, and the how much more applied, the theory applied is, if an unjust judge will vindicate a widow who keeps coming to the judge, how much more will God answer those who cry for vindication? How much more will God answer our prayers for Jesus' second coming?
I've got a question about that last statement.
Yeah.
Because I don't think this is a prayer about Jesus' second coming. And I'm sorry to disagree with you. I think it's a prayer about praying and never giving up. And it's a prayer for justice and never giving up. And it's looking for it. It couches it in the second coming. And when Jesus is coming, will he find faith? That's what he's looking for. But it's not about praying for Jesus' second coming, it seems to me, from the text itself. I don't see that in the text.
I agree. I agree, and I was going in that direction as well. But I think in part, Jesus is responding to those of his followers who are saying, well, when is the final vindication? When is the final coming? And in part, that's it. There's a word in the translation that says, then Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always and not to lose heart or not to become weary. So what does that mean? What does weary mean? So the opposite of weary, according to one of my commentators, is steadfastness, faithfulness, and readiness. And so it's about praying, continuing to pray, not badgering God, but being steadfast in your prayer, and not becoming weary, not giving up. And so it's less about a widow and a judge and more about a relationship. It requires us, as a part of our response to Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, as a response to Jesus' grace, to act upon that grace, to be a person of action, caring for others. And it also requires us, and I'm going to skip sort of to my end of my notes, and then I'll hopefully get back in order here, I'll just read with what one of my really outstanding commentators said, is to continue to pray every day, to pray short, intense, as Martin Luther instructed us. Let me just read this to you. This is from a man who wrote a really thick book that you probably don't want to read. Because I have no life, I read the whole thing almost. It's about 900 pages about parables. It's about 900 pages, and a lot of it is so far over my head, but I tried to plow through it. The guy's name is Snodgrass. I'll give you a reference if you want to look at it. But he says in a couple of different places, the parable urges prayerful and faithful living in the confidence that God will act. So it's in part about prayerful living as a part of our response to grace, and it's in part with the confidence that God will answer the prayers for God's people for vindication. But then he says this, and this never occurred to me, and I studied and read about and prayed about and contemplated this parable for a long time, and this never occurred to me, but I like this. Prayer is constant involvement with God as we interpret and deal with the world in which we live. Prayer is constant involvement with God as we interpret and deal with the world in which we live. I kind of never thought about that statement in the context of this parable, but I was struck by it, and it sort of stopped me in my tracks. I've thought about what prayer is, and I do pray, and maybe not enough, and maybe not intensely enough, and maybe not short enough, but I do pray, and sometimes when I pray, and this is kind of how this came true to me, or rang true to me, I should say. Sometimes when I pray, I feel like even though I'm not, I feel like I'm taking a deep breath, and I'm in the presence of God, and everything's okay, when it's not so okay in my life. So when I say, Dear God, I feel like, I'm sort of in a relationship now. It's a relationship with a perfect God who can do anything, and through God's grace has saved all of us. And I feel that all the things that are going on in the world that aren't so good in my life and further away than my life, I feel like it's kind of, I'm isolated from it all for a minute or two or three or five when I'm praying to God. Do any of you ever feel that when you pray? You're really in the presence of God and all else is... What do you think, John?
That's why I go fishing. No, you get away from the world and pray, and you spend time with Jesus. Reap the rewards of His grace. So it's prayer's an interesting thing. They did a study at Berkeley, of all places. They had 3 test groups, and all the people in the test groups had similar ailments. And the control group, they just treated like everybody else. And then in one group, they had the patients, they prayed for them, and they told them they were praying for them. And in the last group, they had the group of patients, and they prayed for them, but they didn't tell them they were praying for them. There was almost a 50% decline or increase in healing for the two groups that were prayed for. And the two groups that were prayed for were almost identical in the number of people who found cures. So prayer is something that, whether you know about it or whether it's done without you knowing about it, works.
So John, did you all hear that on Zoom? Did you hear what John was saying?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay. I think that's an interesting observation. The disciples are instructed to pray, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done." And prayer, I think you would agree, is a necessary ingredient in our relationship with God. And that prayer, Jesus taught his disciples, was about the end times, when God's kingdom will fully come. It's clear that God cares for us, whether we are doing the right thing or not in our lives. But there is some anxiety now and then about the immediacy of the full realization of the kingdom, when it will come, I suppose now and then. But our readiness for the kingdom is enabled, I think, by an ongoing relationship with God through prayer, among other things. We're called to action, but I think we're also called to prayer, in the confidence that God will act for God's people. So in 8a of this parable, there's a word that's confusing to, maybe contradictory to what I just said. When Jesus starts to explain this parable, listen to what the unjust judge says, "And will not God grant justice to his chosen ones who cry to him day and night?" This is the how much more. If this bad judge is going to grant justice to the world's justice, to this widow, how much more will a loving God grant to those who cry out to him? How much more? But Jesus says in 8, I tell you, God, will quickly grant justice to them. So, what does quickly mean? If he's saying that God will bring God's kingdom quickly, what's Jesus' definition of quickly here? That sort of stopped me. I'm not exactly sure what Jesus means by quickly. He's talking about ultimate vindication, the final judgment, and there's this tension, as I said earlier in the New Testament, about now and not yet. And we still have that tension about now and not yet regarding the eschatology, the end times. But this is an assurance from Jesus that when the end times come, and they will, because God will act, that God will not abandon God's people. God will act, and we should continue to pray as God's people. So, a prayer, I think prayer, and this is a little bit of what Rob said earlier, I think as we're called to action, we're also called to prayer as a part of our life of readiness and faithfulness to God's grace. We're called to prayer as a part of our readiness and faithfulness to God's grace. And that may be the sort of pearl in this very complicated, short parable. Call to prayer as a part of our relationship with God and as a part of our readiness for end times and our faithfulness to God's grace. That may be the part of the lesson here. Any comments on that?
Doug, will you repeat that one more time, please?
Yeah, I can repeat it one more time.
Okay.
Especially if you like it, I'll repeat it one more time. This parable is about the necessity for Jesus' followers to live in a state of readiness and faithfulness, and a part of that state is praying, and the ongoing relationship with God we achieve through prayer. Intense prayer, constant prayer, and short prayers. So God will act, and we know that with certainty. We don't know what quickly means. There's still this tension about now and not yet, but we are living in the kingdom that Jesus did bring, and so we're required to, as Paul says, act in sanctification, react as appropriately to God's grace, react in our lives appropriately to God's grace with acts, with works, but also to maintain our readiness and our faithfulness in prayer.
I was going to say, and add to what you're saying, if you take the first part of this parable, not giving up, this is about praying and not giving up. And if we do give up, the Son of Man comes and doesn't find faith. And if we do persevere, he will find faith. And that's what, for me, the closing passage is tied. The first sentence of this is tied to the last sentence of this. It's about not giving up, so when the Son of Man comes, he will find faithful people here, which is the same type of thing Yahweh was asking of Israel, is, keep the faith and all those things. And you think about all the trials and tribulations that they went through the years, getting to the land of promise, and then afterwards, and coming back from Babylon, and all those things. Part of that is their faithfulness, and always calling us to faithfulness to keep the faith, even when things seem bleak. And for this widow, things seemed a little bit bleak, and you're to the point. If an unjust judge is going to do something, what do you think a just judge is going to do? And that's the more part.
Yep. How much more? If an unjust judge will give this widow relief, how much more will our loving God do for us? How much more? Yep. So it's a short parable. I think it's a short message, but not easy to find, right? I mean, you could read that parable 20 times and still shake your head. I mean, at least I could. So there you go. Any other comments?
I would say that this isn't just any woman. This is a widow. And I think of what James says in his letter, true religion is to care for widows and orphans in their distress. And those were people, as you were saying a little bit earlier, Doug, that are often at the bottom of the pile, and they don't get justice. They don't have somebody to stand up for them. And that the other key part of this is justice. This is not about a prayer request for help. This is not about a prayer request for having a job. This is in a system that is treating some certain people, certain class of people, unfortunately, unjustly, and asking for justice. So maybe our judge here can tie into that too. But part of what it is justice. How do we, liberty and justice for all is one of the things we say in our country, and justice is really important. That's why it's one of the biblical foundations of this country. And so I don't want to overlook the fact that this is about justice.
That's an exclamation point.
That's right.
Exclamation point. This is about justice. Yeah, I said earlier, and I'll say it again, the widows in first century Palestine very few legal rights, very few rights at all. They couldn't inherit property. They were in a very tough situation. So the widows and the orphans would be the least of mine, caring for the least of ours. And I have my only niece. I have one niece, and she is a superstar in my private opinion. I'm slightly prejudiced in that regard, but she went to Wake Forest, where she did very well and was the point guard on the basketball team. And then she went to Wake Forest Law School, and then she went to Princeton for 2 years of a master's degree in public policy, where they select outstanding students. And my brother has told me 50 times, they pay for everything. He's got 4 children that he's put through higher education, and probably took all of his money, or nearly all of his money. 4 smart kids, some of them graduate school and law school. He was delighted to have someone else pay for one of his children to go there. And then she went to work. She's always been a save the world kind of person. So now she's a lawyer, and she's a save the world kind of lawyer. And she's currently working for the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is a very well respected save the world kind of organization. And she gets involved in cases that are just mind-boggling. I mean, she's before the Supreme Court, and her client is a migrant worker or something. It's just really, really interesting. But I do have to kid her, because I'm a lawyer as well. And so her most recent case is representing, is against the state of Mississippi. And I said, so what's the case about? And she said, well, it's about the fact that Mississippi, in our opinion, is not distributing education money fairly. And that is required of them. There was a case against them in the 1890s and again in the 1950s. And now I'm bringing this case because we're alleging they're not fairly distributing education money. And I said, well, what if you win, what's your remedy? She said, well, it's a little complicated, and this is where I started to fall apart. She says, it's a little complicated. The condition for the readmission of Mississippi into the Union after the Civil War between the states, was that they fairly distribute their education money. So if they refuse to do it, I would ask that they be put outside the Union, that their readmission be rescinded. And I immediately said, so if I move there, I don't have to pay federal taxes. She said, Uncle Doug, be serious. This is a serious matter. But, I mean, for regular lawyers that are just trying to help people, buy an office building or recover a debt or something, what she does is in a whole different world than most of us are used to.
To Rob's point, what Rob is talking about is not one widow. He's talking about a whole class of people who are underprivileged, and the same thing with the people in Mississippi who are being discriminated against by an unfair distribution of the tax money. So, I mean, it's not just one person, it's a whole class.
Yep, a whole group of people that don't,
And I was thinking, while you were talking about Sharia and what's going on in Afghanistan, it's all women, it's not just the widows.
Exactly.
It's
Good.
just terrifying and abysmal.
Good point.
What's going on, and what will go on.
In your legal career, which was long and very famous and successful, did you see a lot of cases brought by litigants on behalf of 21st century or 20th century widows and orphans?
Well, to your point on education, we had that case in Arkansas, but it was really tied to the state constitution that the state had to provide, the state, not the school districts, but the state had to provide an equal and suitable education to everybody. And that meant not only equal, suitable education, which meant that you were able to, survive in society. You knew how to survive, do this, that, and
Right.
and a lot of people are getting out of college, know those things.
Yep.
So the education system is failing.
Yep.
Is it your daughter or your granddaughter who's doing the Southern Poverty?
My niece.
Your niece?
Yeah.
Well, more power to her, but I wonder what the ground really is for relief by, the state constitution after the Civil War. That's an interesting theory.
She gets involved in some interesting cases. She worked for the Department of Education in Washington for a number of years, so a lot of her cases are about education. And, you know, we have what we'll say is a very, very good education system in the United States of America, but it can always get better. It's sort of our
But what she's finding, what we found in Arkansas, is people were going to, into college, and they had to take remedial courses. They weren't learning in high school the basics. You know, the system was failing.
That's the way I felt when I was taking calculus in college. It's exactly the way that the system had failed me. I just didn't get it. It was just too hard for me. Any other comments? Any other comments or alternative points of view? Anybody on Zoom got any comments? Everyone's quiet this morning. Everyone's quiet. All right. Next week is week number 7, believe it or not. Week number 7, and I will preview for you that parable, which is also from Luke, and this is pretty interesting. Luke 13:6-9. Very short. Let me read it to you, and then I won't say anything more about it, but it's pretty interesting. Then Jesus told this parable. A man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came looking for fruit on it and found none. So he said to the gardener, "See here, for 3 years I have come looking for fruit on this fig tree, and still I find none. Cut it down. Why should it be wasting the soil?" The gardener replied, "Sir, let it alone for 1 more year until I dig around it and put some manure on it. If it bears fruit next year, well and good, but if not, you can cut it down." That's the end of the parable. Another easy one, right? Another easy one. I'll let you ponder that for the next week, and we'll see what we can figure out next week. These are the group of parables that this particular parable falls under is entitled Parables About Israel. So it's Luke 13. Luke 13. Is that what I said? Luke 13? Luke 13. Yep, Luke 13. We'll talk about that one next week. And if not, we can end early. Any other questions or points of view?
I have 3 oak leaf hydrangeas that I always think of when I read.
3 ugly hydrangeas that won't bloom.
You're right.
Do they get enough sun? Do they...
God only knows. Good answer.
Maybe you need a little manure on it. So, last night there was a big event here about, some of you attended, about the history of High Hampton. So I want to switch a little bit, and I want to point out to you that some people put clothes in their closet. My wife does, that clothes and shoes. And I've got 2 closets, one here and one in Florida, and they're both pretty big relative to closets, and I use 3/4 of my closets for books, because I don't have that many clothes, and I got a lot of books. And I never throw any books away unless I give them to somebody. So yesterday afternoon, I was looking for something, and I found a little book that some of you may have seen. It's called The Mountains in Reply. That's the name of the book, written by Robert Brown, who was the bishop of Arkansas, and there's a picture of him right here. And he is related to one of our distinguished participants here today. And the book is named after a Christmas carol, and the Christmas carol says, "Angels we have heard on high, singing sweetly through the night, and the mountains in reply, echoing their brave delight." And it's a history of this church, and I was looking through it, and any of you that want to borrow it, or maybe they have some more in the office.
Yeah, we've got lots of copies.
It's really, really interesting, and we started coming to this church in 1978, and some of the names, Henry Conkle and others, some of the names just kind of came back to me, and there's a really funny picture of Steve Hines. Really funny. Almost any
That's all
picture.
there is.
One picture of the Reverend John Stephen Hines, and, I mean, it was a long time ago. He's still a fine-looking man, but, this one's pretty funny. And, what I want to close with tonight, this afternoon, this morning, I don't know where I am, is the prayer at the back that the bishop included in this. And so let's be in an attitude of prayer. And I'll read you, and we'll pray together the bishop's prayer. O God, Holy Ghost, sanctifier of the faithful, visit, we pray thee, the congregation of the Church of the Good Shepherd with thy love and favor. Enlighten their minds more and more with the light of the everlasting